So this is a brand new fresh talk, freshly underprepared and slow start into the conference season. My name is Ash Davies. I've been here in Berlin for 8 years, and I'm a GDE for Kotlin and Android. And this is a talk on hype-driven development, or how to follow hype anyway. So during preparation for this talk, I actually noticed a consistent theme in a lot of my talks, where I basically kind of go on to say things that you probably shouldn't do in the code base that I decided to do because, well, it was fun. So basically, all of my talks are summarized in the form of, be careful not to do that thing I did knowingly despite my own advice. Every one of my talks ever. But here's a procrastinator's guide to doing it anyway. So decision-making. Decision-making is one of the most fundamental parts of our daily life, from deciding to give a talk, from deciding to attend one. Good decisions can lead to successes in personal growth, and poor decisions can result in attending a talk on hype-driven development. So decisions are really important here, particularly when they involve a production code base. Good decisions are generally unthought of or not really appreciated, or if something's done right, you generally never hear from it again. But poor decisions can plague the code base for years and end up with a lot of maintenance and extra tech debt, which you just did not need. So like most platforms, Android requires design decisions at almost every level of the tech stack. And such decisions can influence the direction that your application takes in terms of development and maintainability. So some of these comparisons might seem a bit redundant, but these are still questions being asked in real day-to-day life. And these are just a handful of options as well. There are lots of other options we get to choose from. And each one sort of solves the problem to about 90%. It provides almost everything that we need, but maybe not that last little bit. And it also has a little bit extra, or some features that you just maybe don't need to use. And due to their fundamental nature, they are very difficult to encapsulate, thus making it very easy for them to leak the implementation detail into your consuming code, therefore making it even harder to actually remove or replace said tool. So because of this sort of plethora of decisions, you can often lead to indecision paralysis, which is where you don't know what the right decision is, so you don't make a decision. But unfortunately, a lot of the time, the worst decision is actually a decision not made in time, because then things are much worse down the road. Maybe things have changed, the environment of your development environment's changed, or the requirements for your customer or the marketplace, or basically it could be worse for the wear. You only delay war to the advantage of your enemy. That being said, there are times when making no decision at all is justifiable. Maybe you've seen this make the rounds on the Reddit internet recently about doing nothing. Now, whilst it's not always the best decision to do nothing at all, it is important to remember that it is an option. So there's a possibility that the solution that you choose will actually cause irrevocable harm to your project. So compare it to do something with nothing means that you can evaluate the actual harm it could do. On the other side of the coin, you've got decision fatigue. Now, as I said, we make decisions at every point of our life and every point of our day. So before the day is done, we can easily have made hundreds of decisions. What do I have for breakfast? Should I skip lunch? Do I kick the cat? Don't kick the cat. So it can be very tiring to have to do this all the time. And by the end of it, you are in a position where you don't want to make a decision, or you're just tired of it, so that you will decide something that is either easy or maybe not fit for purpose, or maybe even something that you're familiar with, something that is called the law of tool. I'll come into it in a minute. So with that in mind, how can hype in the development community affect decision-making? So first of all, let's look at where decision-making comes from. Now, one of the most organic mechanisms for decision-making comes from feature requirements, wherein a tool is chosen to fit the requirements of the needs. This can come from stakeholder influence, things like people like product owners or managers or CEOs or CTOs, where they say that this is the feature that to be developed. Other reasons can be reaction to technical debt. For example, if you've got a particular bugging issue that's been plaguing your code base for a long while, and eventually you finally manage to make a decision on what to do about it. And of course, new tech always promises faster and easier solutions. So it's very easy for us to become enticed in this. And it's important to remember as well, this is not just limited to engineering. Decisions like this come from all directions. Specifically as well, they can come from higher up. For example, the CEO's 14-year-old daughter just thought of a really cool idea for this app, and that's absolutely the same opinion that all of your users will have. So I mentioned earlier about using a tool that you're familiar with, and this is often called the law of the instrument. And during my research, I found out this is also called the Birmingham screwdriver, which is a derogatory term for people from Birmingham. So it can be tempted if the only tool you have is a hammer for everything to look like a nail. The joke here is that if you're not intelligent enough with a screwdriver, you use a hammer. And it really has some implications on your code base. So, decision paralysis or fatigue can result in engineers using the most familiar tool. If it's familiar for whatever reason, you worked on it in your previous project, you worked on it in your side project, or it's just something you read on Reddit today. This is always something to be aware of. But primarily, is the influence on design decisions that comes from the community. Now, this is things like conferences that we're all here for, and the idea is to sort of entice you to use a product or a service. There are loads of sponsors outside, there are loads of sponsored speakers, there are loads of talks about these topics, about new releases, and whilst it's all very good, remember that it's there for a purpose. It's seemingly benevolent, so this is going to solve all your problems and fix your life entirely, but remember that it's only trustworthy whilst your goals are aligned, so whilst you're looking for the same thing. For example, Android itself, it's a wonderful platform, but it's important to remember that it's part of Google's ecosystem for advertising. Same with Chrome and for a lot of products. These are here to make money at the end of the day. Who knew? Community influence often comes through different channels, but primarily it's found on social media. This can be Reddit or Twitter or Facebook, blogs, you name it. And it's appealing because it kind of appeals to our base nature as humans. We are shiny, chasing object monkeys that, we may as well be magpies. So there's a phrase, there's a term, argumentum ad novitatum, which means basically newer is better, or the fallacy for a person to place a heavy bias on one solution because it's simply newer. And now we all know that new doesn't necessarily equal better, but, human dumb. Furthermore, when something is promising to make your life easier, better, faster, stronger, more like Daft Punk, it's quite easy to kind of fall into this trap, or not a trap, but fall. So there obviously are risks that come with using immature software. And I don't mean immature as a derogatory term. I simply mean software that just hasn't been around for that long. So there will be inherent risks for this. You are sort of tying yourself down to making yourself dependent on a third-party software provider. Usually this is fine if the third party is trustworthy or has like a good track record with maintaining software and not killing off services, like Inbox. And sometimes libraries take a little while to mature. It can take years for a library to kind of realize its full potential and actually either become bigger or even become smaller, actually better fitting your use case. But it kind of makes it very difficult to revert if the results are undesired. So say you adopted a new library and it promises to solve all your problems, but turns out actually it doesn't solve anything, it causes more work than you had first anticipated. It's difficult to then remove that, so you've actually got more work to even just go back to where you were. So there's a lot of risk there, and it's very likely that you're going to produce poor quality code because you're trying to fix a mistake. There's often a new learning curve with it as well, and you're basically investing in an unknown future. Now, don't get me wrong, adventuring in the unknown can be very rewarding, but it's important to be aware of the risks. It's unknown. So risk management is not just manager speak, but it's actually something very useful for technologists or anyone who's risk averse. So method of risk management could be something as simple as a deprecated annotation. If we look at this, this was just an example I'm using, so don't take it as my endorsement of RxJava. But it's a way of managing risks. So what we're doing here is giving an informative message to the consumer, saying, why this is deprecated, giving them a level of deprecation. So will it actually cause the compiler to fail, or is it just simply something that the user needs to be aware of? But most importantly, it's providing migration tools here. So with the replace with annotation, you can actually use the shortcut in IntelliJ to replace all usages of this in your entire code base, which is very, very useful, and it makes it much less destructive if you're following the recommendation from the SDK provider or the library provider or the author of the tool. Next to this, we have opt-in annotations in Kotlin, which you may or may not already be aware of, but you can create as many of your own annotations as you like and apply them in different places. It's especially useful when you use it in combination with a DSL marker. This means that you can force the user to have to opt in to using something, which doesn't stop them from using it, but it does make them consciously aware of that step that they've taken. It makes sure that you can isolate your SDK code into like having a smaller API surface, which can be very useful and can really mitigate your risks. So in addition to annotations, there are lots of other ways to kind of manage your risks of this one. So ideally, code should be disposable and built in such a way that code can be deleted without any side effects. There's another talk I gave last year called Everything is an API, where I advocated for code disposability. The best code you can write is code that is most easily deletable. Also, it's fun. If you isolate the API surface as well, then you're going to have less interaction with these different things, and it's less likely that something can go wrong. And if you don't even want to go that far in the first place of integrating it at all, you can propose coding workshops or hack weeks or things during your work time where you try out different software and try out its feasibility or its viability for your product. And more specifically, a bit more targeted, you can do feasibility investigations. So say you have to develop new feature A, and you think library X is the best job for the purpose. So you do a feasibility study into doing this to make sure that it actually does fulfill that purpose before fully committing to actually having the solution in place. There's another aspect as well of this called solutions looking for a problem. Now, you probably all kind of stumbled across this at some point in your life after going to a conference. You come back from a conference, you're full of all these ideas, like, oh my God, I have to implement Compose now, I have to introduce this new library, or Retrofit's got a new annotation. It's so amazing. So when you have these amazing solutions, it's sometimes easy to find yourself looking for a problem that solution solves, when actually there wasn't that problem in the first place. Example here is the self-operating napkin, which is one of the types of solutions that makes you question what the problem was in the first place. So this is more of a self thing. You have to be wary of it, be vigilant on your own behavior, and try not to do this. Of course, this advice is not relevant to the blockchain, since this has neither a solution nor a problem. Pause for effect. So stay aware of the scope of your project, its requirements and its behaviors. Because it can sometimes be easy to seek out problems that don't yet exist. Make sure that the technology you're choosing or the solution you're choosing is appropriate for your project, and be cautious of finding problems that don't exist. And crucially, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Sometimes code doesn't need to be refactored or made shiny or change to use this new migration or change to use this new version of software. If you're not having a problem with it, if it's not causing you issues, maybe it's fine the way it is. There's another comic here because I was a bit low on slides, so I'm just going to add this here. But Monkey User is one of my favorite comics where, yeah, in this example, they built a jet engine for a seat. Cool. But we wouldn't all be here today if there wasn't an upside to using new technology. And of course there is. New technology is actually often very helpful, and it's not a doomsaying thing for me to say, be careful. Actually, it's awesome, but just be careful. So sometimes if the software decisions are actually inevitable, for example, with using Jetpack Compose, we already know that this is the future of UI development, so it's quite safe for us to actually start using this and commit to this, not only because we know it's the future of UI development, but because it has the backing of a very trustworthy source. And Google has promised to develop this in the future, so we can be a bit sure about this. And if you're becoming an early adopter, if it means you're already ahead of the curve. You're integrating software that you're going to have to do anyway, so it just means less tech debt. If you're using things a bit eagerly, you can contribute bug reports, even include new features, be part of that development process, and even guide the development process into features that might be more appropriate for you. I mean, feedback is always useful, especially with SDK and tool development. And those new features might even provide you with a potential for market growth or potential advantage over your market competitors. And naturally, of course, knowledge sharing in the development community. This is the most important thing that can be stated, I think. Knowledge sharing in the community is just so vastly useful to everyone involved. And as I mentioned in the first point, there is a certain amount of inevitability to some things. For example, compose. Not sure if you've seen this one, but yeah, welcome to software development at Google. Don't use this deprecated API, use this under construction API. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Is it worth it? That's the ultimate question here. So, weighing up all the risks and all the things that you can afford to take risks on is the most important question because, this is where you're going to get the risk-benefit analysis from. So risk-benefit analysis, not just for managers, actually, it's something we should probably be doing more often. But it depends a lot on your team. Do you have a large enough team that you can absorb this extra time? Can you commit to doing extra development or refactoring if it was necessary? Obviously, development community involvement in the development community benefits everybody. So this is always going to be a good thing, but who's going to pay that cost is ultimately the question. And being an early adopter, because early adopters tend to be a bit more progressive or enthusiastic. Everyone here is engaged and actually seeking out knowledge. So except for people leaving. And yeah, so it's generally systematic that you'll be enthusiastic about it, and who can absorb that cost. But let's say you've seen this new fancy library and you don't have a use case for it in your app, but you want to use it anyway. That's basically the whole idea of this talk. How to get away with it anyway. So I want to use this new fancy camera API, even though my app takes no camera pictures. What to do? Well, it's still not a good idea to use a production code base as your test bed. It's going to be unreliable, it's unpredictable, you probably shouldn't do it. But you're still eager to try out this new technology. What to do? Open source. So there's a lot of people who maintain a playground repository where they can safely sandbox ideas and work with new technologies. And it's actually quite useful because being able to sort of scratch that itch of playing with new tech without having the negative consequence of crashing your app. There's also lots of examples and lots of sample applications in Google repositories, which you can then either get involved with or contribute to or even clone yourself and then just play with it. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And there's also a lot of open source projects which are begging for maintainers, people to get involved with. So there's usually almost always going to be a use case for this new shiny tool that you want to use. So contribute to a project that can actually make use of it. But if you want to make your own playground project, you could be in the same position I was, where I was thinking, well, now I actually am looking for a problem for a solution. So ignore that last part. But what should my app do? It's just a playground app to demonstrate technology. It doesn't actually have to fulfill a real-life purpose. Well, there's actually a lot of options. So majority of most mobile applications are basically a fancy way of showing a list of data. Yeah, I just invalidated our entire profession. But there are lots of APIs that sort of provide niche data sets, like the International Space Station data, or APIs for fortune cookies, or Chuck Norris jokes, or obscure beers. There's always going to be something that you can use. And this is where I'm going to show you a quick demo of my playground project. So using it as a case study, this is a project I used to sort of combine all the technology into one place, and was actually the underlying idea for this talk about how everything in one kind of bucket can go dramatically wrong. So actually using an older version of AGP because it has a dependency with Compose for desktop. This is JetBrains Compose, not Jetpack Compose. Very important distinction. So that's why it's also using Kotlin 1.6. So the goal of this project was to basically list conference data, to list all the conferences coming up in the near future. That would be quite easy just to manually create this list and update it all the time. But I'm an engineer. I'm looking for something a bit more automatic. And where do we have an automatic source of conference listings? Well, we have the ASG, the Android Study Group on Slack, which maintains an open source list of conferences that are upcoming, the call for proposals, and information about the conference if it's online or in person, etc. The app was to be built around Compose for desktop, because Compose is shiny and Kotlin is new. Sorry, other way around. Compose is new and Kotlin is shiny. And it would be backed by Cloud Functions and Firebase Firestore, sharing the models across all the platforms, and basically being like a quasi mono-repo for all of my ideas and projects that I probably would crash any normal app. Actually, also crash this app. But I chose to put it in a mono-repo just because it was easy for dependency management. So this is what the website looks a little bit. So it's kind of a bit small, but there's not a lot of information there. It's just basically a list of conferences and if the CFP is open. So I start my investigation and open up the GitHub API Explorer, and I was like, OK, so this is all on GitHub. I should be able to use GitHub to fetch this data in a mobile-friendly format, right? It should be there. GitHub is a big enough API, GitHub is a big enough company. They should have a well-developed API. That is not the truth. So if you try and access the Contents API from GitHub, you'll get something like this, where it provides a lot of metadata about the object you're looking at, or the file node that you're looking at. And this actually isn't so useful. When looking through this the first time, I was thinking, OK, so there's a lot of noise there, but maybe there's something I can use. But actually, there's nothing about the contents there. This is just a pointer to the contents, which is wonderful, because that would mean I have to then make a single request to the GitHub API for each conference found in this listing. And there's quite a few hundred. So I would quickly reach the GitHub API limits set out on the free tier. And it's also not really advisable to send off a few hundred requests simultaneously in a mobile application, generally frowned upon. But furthermore, when I actually followed this link to the point of the data, I found that it's actually like this. It's a dirty YAML representation of the conference, and I call it dirty YAML not because it's dirty in any way, but actually because it uses inconsistent formatting. So most conventional YAML parsers will actually fail to parse this. So I had to write my own, naturally. So I haven't introduced a new library for a while, GraphQL. So it was quite refreshing to find out that GitHub actually also provides a GraphQL endpoint where you can use this GraphQL client instead. Unfortunately, with GraphQL, you can actually specify the data you want to receive in the request, so you have to make much fewer more requests. So with a query like such, I can request all the data I need in one go. Very, very nice. And it looks like this. So I've only requested the ID number and the text of the content. So the content is still encoded in a YAML file. So GitHub, as a content service provider, only provides you the raw content. It's not going to actually encode YAML for you. If you input YAML, you'll get out YAML. So I needed to use an intermediary to sort of sit between these two things and sort of translate the data into something a bit more palatable for mobiles. So for that, I decided to use Firebase Functions because new features. So I can store it in, so use Firebase Functions to actually kind of fetch the data and aggregate everything, and then can use Firestore to actually store it and fetch it through this Firebase function and check if it's out of date, stale, etc. So all is great, yeah. Except that with Firebase Functions, you need to use TypeScript. And TypeScript is such a wonderful language that I might just leave Kotlin. So the first implementation was just something like this. It's collapsed a little bit for brevity, but the idea is there. Not my best work. It's just a basic, quick script to get the job done. And yeah, it works. But I wasn't satisfied with something that's just merely functional. It's also got to be fancy. So I decided to take the opportunity to introduce Kotlin multi-platform for this. Because, I can write JavaScript code with Kotlin, right? So the idea would be to drop all that extra code with npm bloat necessary for deploying a JavaScript application, And Kotlin multi-platform brings a lot of other benefits as well, where you can share code across multiple platforms and reduce the amount of code necessary. This isn't a pitch for multi-platform. You can ask any other person for that, but it's great. Yeah, and one of the nice things about it as well is that you don't really have to concern yourself with multi-platform UI design, which has been one of the most failures for every other attempt at cross-platform technology. Think Flutter, think React Native, think, yeah. So simply having your domain logic in multi-platform is very logical. So Kotlin for JavaScript. So with multi-platform, we'll be able to share the models for network and data in the function code. It also allows you to use node libraries as well, which is quite useful. So then you could, in theory, continue to use the Firebase admin APIs from within Kotlin. However, to sort of maintain compatibility, as some might know, with Kotlin JS and Kotlin other features, you have to use a lot of this dynamic typing, which means you don't actually benefit from the static typing that Kotlin has to offer on a lot of the language features because you're working essentially in JavaScript. So once you convert your code from TypeScript to Kotlin, you'll find that it looks kind of similar because, yeah, you've had to use dynamic and everything's unknown. So it's not a great load of benefit of using Kotlin over TypeScript in the first place here. But because I was not to be deterred, after a lot of research and Stack Overflowing, I managed to eventually ship a functioning function. Woohoo! And it kind of worked. It did actually work, except there were some side effects that I hadn't anticipated. The irony of this screenshot is that whilst it did actually succeed, both the automatic actions on GitHub failed, and I used the wrong signing key to commit it, so, ironic. But then later I would discover that actually the Firebase admin code, which I thought had been shipped with the artifact, actually didn't ship with the artifact because it didn't recognize it in the build file because it was still thinking and expecting a node-based system, not Kotlin code compiled into JavaScript. So I managed to then compile it into almost like a shadow jar for JavaScript, which kind of worked as well, but it was very tedious and just not quite fixing all the problems. So by this point, I'm kind of a bit tired, hitting my head against the wall, and I'm taking a small break in the presentation to introduce my cat. Here is Cotty. So yeah, I was kind of tired hitting my head against the wall and sort of not kind of making any progress. Why can't this stuff just work out of the box, right? Well, then I kind of remembered, oh, wait, the whole point of this exercise was to experiment with technology in a playground where it's safe to use it and isn't going to affect any production code. So yeah, no surprise, it might not work. Yeah, this is still Cotty. He's very good at posing. And it would be a bit rude, I think, to introduce Cotty and not introduce his brother Pi, who knows exactly how to pose for a photo. So what is quite funny as well, actually, then, is that after reaching this point where I was almost ready to give up, I stumbled across this article after a discussion in Kotlin Lang Slack from Andrew Reitz. And yeah, basically turned out he'd gone through the exact same process I had, except 2 years ago, and came to the conclusion that Firebase wasn't the right choice of tool. Actually, you should use Google Cloud. And then after investigating that, whilst I already knew about Google Cloud Functions, I hadn't actually evaluated it as a reasonable choice. But actually, since you can deploy with Java, it's much, much, much better. So thank you, Andrew. And I decided to give it the restrictions of using Firebase Cloud Functions and migrate to Google Cloud Functions. Very similar. You just have to write your own deploy script. And it supports Java out the box. So a shadow bundle Kotlin jar worked just fine. Awesome. So I ended up with a project structure that looked a little bit something like this, where you can see the events on the side, where it actually then relates to local remote and local storage, just sort of what the project looks like. And there's a cat in the corner. I would be able to show you this functioning, however, I broke it. But that's the whole point, right? So the features that I'm currently working on, I'm trying to actually introduce Compose multi-platform in a Google Cloud function. So it's like a headless UI with Compose, because why not? So that's the point. I'm using this safe environment to demo these things. And it's not the only failure I've had with this. So there's been a lot of different failures where I've just completely tried to use technologies together, and it's gone tits up. And yeah, there's been lots of other clusterfucks in that kind of thing. And one approach I even tried was to actually ship the Git client in the artifact to then clone a Git repository in a cloud function, thereby be able to pass the YAML data. That was just madness. Yeah, so I was trying to use the AppCheck API, but if you're trying to do it with multi-platform, you don't have an SDK for that, so you have to use the REST API. So you're having to use the REST API to both issue your tokens and then to verify them, and then as an intermediary between Firebase and your own services, it gets very complicated and unnecessary. And combining dependencies with composite build plugins and version catalogs. It turns out actually there's not a lot of SDKs for multi-platform Firebase, even though there actually are some, but not always for desktop. And also the Mosaic library for Compose Desktop, which was actually quite fun and successful. Since the Mosaic library from Jake Warden, the plugin itself will actually check if it's using JVM and will not allow you to use it on other projects. But actually, it turns out to be quite easy to use the runtime specifically just to launch a Compose in a headless environment. Now, of course, I've been talking to you all about how I maintain a personal project repository outside of my work time. And now, for everyone, that's not, that's just simply not appropriate. Because it's completely fine. Be very clear on this. It's completely fine if you don't want to spend time outside of your working hours on work. I mean, of course, we have our own lives to maintain. We have families, we have pets, we have all these different things. So it's perfectly fine and feasible to not spend time on pet projects. Some people are actually fortunate enough to have this time dedicated as part of their daily routine or part of their work life, which is outstanding and awesome, something we should definitely be encouraging more often. And unfortunately, though, that's not always the case for everybody. So you can be that person, that ambassador inside your organization to advocate for time to evaluate feasible technology. It's really in your business's best interest to spend time on this, to actually spend some time investigating the feasibility of something before actually committing to using so. You can save a lot of lost development hours on this. And you can also propose solutions for internal tooling. Now, most of the time, companies will use internal tooling, things for payroll, HR, all these different things. But often, you'll never actually be quite happy with the solution, or maybe there's something that you need internally, but there's not really a feasible proposal out there. You can propose something yourself. Why not suggest, oh, I want to build this application that will help us integrate with this development thing. It doesn't really matter, as long as it actually has business feasibility. And don't forget to make the business use case. Always talk about money when speaking with managers. They're easier for them to understand. And ultimately, if you do need to use production code for new technologies that you're not so sure about or that you just want to try out for shits and giggles, then code for disposability. Make sure that you are building in such a way that your code could be easily disposed upon or replaced or removed. So concluding this, there's a very reasonable argument for making design decisions. There is rarely a reasonable argument on making design decisions based upon your opinion. Don't introduce tools to a project that doesn't need it. Find a project that does. So don't use hype in production environments, like hype as though some energy thing to use. Satisfy your dev thirst if you really must in a safe environment, so open source or in personal playground projects or anything that you can kind of do with this. Use your learnings to advise feasibility. One of the great things that you can do with these playground projects is mess about, play with things, break things, and find out what does and doesn't work. So the next day you go to work and you find, OK, well, I tried this out in my other project. I know if it doesn't work or not. So I can say with more confidence if it's justifiably usable for my work project. And ultimately, share learnings with the community. So this is why we're all here, knowledge sharing and sharing your experience. Every integration, every usage, every day can be a story. It's really important to give your experience on this. Even if you think that somebody has given the similar story or given the same story on the same tool or same solution, your experience is still unique and useful. So don't forget to share that. And finally, I'm going to leave you with this quote that I always like ending my last few talks on. There's a variant of this that is more specific to coding, and that's every line of code is written without reason, maintained out of weakness, and deleted only by chance. And it's painfully true. If you look through your code base, like, it's very rare that you actually get to delete something. So just be aware of that when introducing new things, because you may well be the person having to maintain it. Thank you.